Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Morning. Well, first of all, it's a very warm welcome to Harper Adams, and it's great to see so many of you here. And I'm very much hoping that we are going to have an informative day today, and that you'll all take something away from today that you can use in your businesses. This event has sort of been put together to focus really on farming and the practical steps that can be taken to cut emissions, which is of course very much at the top of many of our agendas at this point. My name is Philip Grady. I'm the chairman of the Royal Agricultural Society of England, and my task is to give you a background to what we're going to be doing today and to introduce our first speaker. So this event is being held to bring to life a report which RASE put together and was published last year, entitled Farm of the Future and Journey to Net Zero. So the report was published almost exactly a year ago, and has got some key messages in there for both farmers and also for those who shape agricultural policy. And I think the idea is that today we'll highlight some of those new technologies and changes that can be made to farm practices to enable that transition to start to take place. So for those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to read the report, and I do commend it to you, it's a comprehensive publication, and it brings together an industry-wide view, and it's got over 30 contributing authors, and it's got lots of sort of case studies embodied within the report as well. But it's very much practical. It's a practical document, and it demonstrates the practical steps that can be taken by farmers and land managers to decarbonise their businesses in a way which is both economically and environmentally sustainable. This event itself is being run by RASE's sister charity, Innovation for Agriculture, or IFA. Many of the team are here today, and I'd like to give a special thanks to the DULVERTON Charitable Trust for supporting IFA, both with the concept and the delivery and running of this event. So none of us would be here today if it weren't for their support, and so for that we are immensely grateful and thank them. We're also delighted to be working with Harper Adams, who are very much at the cutting edge of what's happening in this particular area. So we thank them. They're also involved in the running of this seminar itself, as is the RASE team, so thank you to RASE for their contribution. The fact that this is actually a sellout event, well, I've seen some empty seats, but I know one or two are still on the way, says something about where this sits on people's agenda, and I think the need for independent guidance and knowledge exchange as we go forward. So we're very fortunate to be joined by an excellent lineup of speakers today, both on our panels and also in the technical sessions. And in addition to that, we've got a number of UK-based companies who are involved in the sector and who are helping to shape the future of farming. So please do make the most of the knowledge in the room. Ask technical heads any questions that you might have as we go through the day. And obviously, when we've got time outside of this room, there's some great networking opportunities and get to know others. And we very much believe in the concept at RASE of peer-to-peer learning. And so it's fantastic that we've got well over 50% of the people in this room are actually practical farmers, which is tremendous. So we hope that all of you will take something away from today that will have a direct impact on your business and help you to plan for the future. And that might be including a greater focus on cutting livestock emissions, it might be improving soil health, as well as the generation of clean energy and replacing fossil fuels on the farm, which is where we must eventually end up. So this session is going to commence with the keynote address, followed by the first farmer panel debate. And just before we get started, just on a housekeeping point, and it's normally me who's offending, but if you could either turn your phones off or turn them on to silent, please. And in the event that there is a need to evacuate this building. It's pretty self-explanatory where you need to get out, and they've told me there are no testings, alarms taking place today, so it'll be real if it happens. Now, having written an excellent and insightful preface for the Farm of the Future report, it seemed only right that we should ask Lord Deben to provide our keynote address today. John has been involved in agricultural policy for well over 30 years, initially as... Thank you. Okay, right, slight change of plan. You've now got me for half an hour. No, you haven't. What's happened, I think, is that Lord Deben is joining us after the first panel debate, okay? What we're going to do is I'm going to invite the panel to come forward, do their thing, and then we'll transfer back to Lord Deben. So this is this is always an interesting test of our ability. So what I think I've got to do is to pass over to Michael, who's going to introduce the panel members, and they're going to give some presentations. So Michael, over to you. Michael Cox, over to you, and I shall reappear at the end.
Thank you, Philip.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Philip. Lord Deben, thank you. So for those people who don't know me, I'm Michael Lee. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at Harper Adams, and I just wanted to add to Philip's welcome to Harper Adams. It's great to see a packed auditorium, usually packed full of students, happy students, learning about sustainable agriculture. And as Philip said, you are certainly in the right institution. Harper Adams' focus is on sustainable agriculture since 1901, and we furthered that commitment recently, post becoming a university, to drive the agricultural transition as we realise sustainable net zero. Because of course sustainable farming isn't just about carbon, it's also about making a profit, protecting nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, and also protecting biodiversity, animal welfare, rural communities. And of course, critically opening up into urban society. The challenge of feeding what will be, on now population geneticists tell us, 11 billion people on the planet when we eventually plateau, is the greatest challenge which has faced anthropogenic Earth. And therefore we need everybody in society associated with agri-food. This great institute, which has traditionally supported the sons and daughters of farmers, now needs to support everyone in realising what sustainable agri-food is. So welcome to Harper Adams, and big thank you to RASE, Philip and the team in terms of all their hard work in realising this event. As part of your day, you'll see some of the innovations that are happening at Harper Adams. You will have an opportunity to interact with our Future Farm members. Richard Hooper is here. There's Richard. Shake. There's Richard Hooper, our director of Future Farm. Please engage with Richard so he can tell you more about what we're doing to realise a journey and exemplify a journey to net zero by 2030. Huge challenge, Richard. But also, we recognise this, of course, at Harper Adams, that we're not an island. As great as this institute may be in supporting the agri-food sector, we cannot do it alone. We need to work with industry, particularly our farming community, and we need to work with other academic organisations who have phenomenal skill sets in realising what a just agricultural transition is. To realise this, we established the School of Sustainable Food and Farming, which I was delighted to say will be working alongside RASE to show the videos associated with this conference today. So Alex Hardy, is Alex here? Where's Alex? He's over here. So Alex is our Business Development Manager for the School of Sustainable Food and Farming, so please speak to Alex and you'll hear more about that. And you saw the video associated with the School of Sustainable Food and Farming as you came in. So my role this morning is to chair a fantastic panel to hear from the farming community about their journey to net zero. In the first panel discussion, solutions and opportunities for your future your farm of the future. I'm delighted that we've got 4 amazing, I see 3 amazing. Abby is not here yet, but if anyone knows Abby, she will just rush in and give a fantastic talk, as she always does. So hopefully Abby will be here when we come to her. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, who needs very little introduction, Helen Browning OBE, Chief Executive of the Soil Association. And each of our panellists is going to come up and give an 8-minute presentation first, and then join me in a panel discussion. So Helen has been Chief Executive of the Soil Association since 2011. She is a Commissioner for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission and sits on the BBC's Rural Affairs Advisory Committee. Helen has had a number of roles in agri-politics over the years, including the Government's Policy Commission on the Future of Farming and Food. Helen runs an organic farm in Wiltshire with dairy, beef, pigs, cereals, and is also experimenting with agroforestry, as some of our other panellists are. Her products are sold through the Helen Browning's organic brand in retailers, as well as through her mini hotel and restaurant pub on the farm. Certainly making me hungry, Helen. So Helen, without further ado, I'll ask you to come up to give your 8-minute presentation to the audience. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, great. Lovely to see everybody. Thanks for having me along today. I've got 8 minutes to tell you everything I don't know about how to get to net zero in farming. As I think we'll explore today, this is a hugely complex topic, and trying to find the right roadmaps for our individual farms is not straightforward. We know this is a decade where we've got to get all this stuff right. We know that farming is a huge part of the solution rather than a huge part of the problem, potentially, but it's not easy to try and work out where we go. So I'm going to be very honest about where we've got to, and hope that I go away having really learned how I should be doing it from all you guys here today. So the first thing, obviously, we all need to be doing, and we did a couple of years ago properly for the first time, was to establish where we are today. What are our emissions? What's the level of the challenge we've got on our own farm? Now, there is a question, of course, about whether we look at this at a farm level or a supply chain level or a country level, because all of those issues of offshoring, if we put more trees in and produce less food, how does that get compensated for elsewhere? There are issues around diet and all that kind of stuff. But just for me, I thought, let's get and really understand what we're doing on the farm and how big our challenge is. So I took on a research student for 9 months to look at our whole farm emissions, to look at it at an individual enterprise level. I was particularly interested in the 2 quite different organic dairy systems we run, one a twice a day autumn calving, slightly higher cake system, the other one a once a day, bigger herd, very pasture based, spring calving herd. I also wanted to look at the nutrient balance on the farm, what was coming on, what was going off, because we've got to get that stuff right. And I wanted to start to think about what our mitigation options were. We did this work with 3 of the calculators. I wanted to see what was the difference between them. There were some differences. In the end, we worked mostly with the Farm Carbon Toolkit because it allowed us, the only one that currently allows us to factor in soil sequestration into the framework. So we did all of that, and we also benchmarked all of our fields. We've been testing for organic matter on our fields over the last 10 or 15 years, and we updated that on all fields, did it really properly with doing our bulk densities and everything else to try and give us a really good sense of where our soils were at. The results, I mean, I won't give you, but we, on the basis of what our soils were doing, we were, and the woodland we planted and the agroforestry and that kind of thing, although that's relatively small beer compared to the soils, we were sequestering about 70% of our emissions. But that still leaves a socking big amount, over 1,000 tonnes of carbon per year to deal with. And the big factor, being a largely dairy farm, we're milking about 500 cows in total, the big issue, of course, was methane. Now, trying to work out okay, how do I offset, how do I inset that residual 1,000 tons of carbon? I worked out, and these are all approximate figures, that I'd need to plant about another 100 kilometres of hedgerow. This is on a 1,600 acre farm. That's kind of doable if we put a hedge on every fence line, particularly up our downland where we don't have many hedges. And I'd need to plant about another 100 hectares of woodland. So about 15% of our land going into woodland or forestry or agroforestry, that sort of number of trees. And of course those trees, when they're young, don't do very much in terms of sequestration. And there's a big question about how long our soils will continue to sequester carbon at the rate they're currently sequestering it. So there are a lot of unknowns in this still. But that was where I kind of thought, well, that's a sort of framework I can start to work within. So started to look at, particularly at the methane question, and where was the science on methane inhibitors, how can we reduce the amount of methane that our cattle are producing, and that's particularly challenging, actually. It's going to be particularly challenging for free-range animals. I think some of the inhibitors that are coming through, the seaweed-based materials, will be much easier to use in house systems. Our cattle are housed for some of the year. Most of them are housed for 6 months, and some of them are housed for 5 months, and some of them are only housed for a couple of months. Looking at natural sources of methane inhibition is really interesting for us, and hard to do the work on compared to being able to put those animals into a controlled environment. But there's some really interesting stuff coming through on willow. And willow grows for a pastime for us down on our heavy clay soils, so there's something really interesting there, where recent results suggesting that might reduce methane by about 30%, nitrous oxide possibly slightly more, and the potential for high tannin herbs and things in our herbal lays, I think, is also really, really interesting. One of the other things we are very keen to explore more is how we do methane capture from our slurry. Again, there's some really interesting work coming through, sucking out, putting covers over slurry pits and being able to suck out that methane and turn it into a fuel. That, I think, holds a lot of promise if we can get it to work. We're going to have to look at, at cow numbers over time. We know that the methane challenge, if you're looking at a GWP star, that actually if you slightly decrease your herd over a long period of time, your methane is sort of stable because it has a shorter shelf life than carbon dioxide. So I think over time we'd probably have to look at numbers. And then some of the other things I'm exploring, when we're doing building work, we should be building with wood now, or with materials where we're reducing the embedded carbon in our building materials. How do we make stuff last? The inventory carbon impacts are high, so how do we make sure that we are making our kit last longer? And then low fuel. Fuel for us is actually still a tiny part of the jigsaw compared to the methane and the nitrous oxide challenge, because we're a livestock farm. But a lot of those low fuel solutions are also soil improving solutions. So things like pasture cropping, strip till systems, which we're doing quite a lot with now on the farm, outdoor wintering of cattle, and moving to a much more pasture-fed basis. And of course, we're not just trying to look at the carbon end of this, we're trying to look at all those other things, the biodiversity, the water quality, as I said, the nutrient balance, the animal welfare, the social impacts. And I think as a sector, we really do need to have a standardized way of measuring the impacts that our farming systems are having, the methodologies for capturing that data, and trying to make sure that the benefits of what we do come back to the farming community. I know a lot of people are already starting to think about selling their carbon, and I think there are some real pitfalls in that until we've established what the rules of the game are. So at the Soil Association, one of the things that we've done is to establish a framework for doing that measuring of the impacts of that broad basket of things, not just carbon. so that we can help give good advice to farmers who want to reduce their impacts and improve the outcomes of their farming systems. So Soil Association Exchange is our contribution, working with a lot of corporates to try and get the rules of the game right. But we need government to get involved with that too. So just 2 or 3 final points to leave you with. I think even knowing what we could do here, and I've just talked about some of the nature-based solutions, the hedges and the trees and the soils, the investment required, the capital investment and the labour investment to do that is enormous. We've struggled this winter just to put a mile of hedgerow in and a couple of acres of shelter belt. And actually trying to do it at the scale we're talking about here, even though I think it would give us a better, more resilient farm at the end of the period, is not without its challenges. And how to do that while we stay profitable. The investment that needs to go in to actually transition our farms to something that looks like net zero and brings all those other benefits is going to be a challenge financially for us. But I can see a future state for my farm, actually, which, if I tackled this challenge in the kind of ways I'm talking about, would give us much better animal welfare, much more resilience in terms of having trees as a fodder source, not just for shade and shelter. To have other income streams from trees, whether it's the fruits and nuts and stuff that we're planting, or longer term through timber and other resources. So I can see that there is an end state that I want to get to. I can see what that looks like vaguely, but we do still need help with that route map as to how we're going to transition and the investment that's going to be required to get us there. That's my 2 pennies to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was perfect. So I'd now like to hand over to Louise Manning. She's no stranger to Harper Adams. Louise is a professor of sustainable agri-food systems at the Lincoln Institute for Agri-Food Technology at the University of Lincoln and has worked for over 35 years in the agri-food supply chain in a range of roles. Her expertise is in the area of food security and food integrity, including food safety, food quality, food crime, policy, governance, social and corporate responsibility, resilience risk assessment, and mitigation strategies. Louise has carried out projects for government bodies and companies, including strategic risk analysis and mitigation. Louise, we very much look forward to hearing your 8 minutes. Thank you. Well, I'll you to get to the lecture first.
Okay, so good morning. I could talk about so many things standing here for 8 minutes, but I'm going to talk about poultry production. When I use the word we, it's quite difficult because we have a farm at the University of Lincoln and we have a farm as in my family. So I may have to double check myself sometimes when I use the word we. Can I have a show of hands? How many people were farming in 1998? Okay, so you will remember what happened in that year. Now, lots of things happened in that year, but you will remember the 3 separate codes that came in, the air, water, and soil code. How many of you still have them? There you go. And in it, I was looking, and carbon is embedded in the soil code. Good soil management is embedded in that soil code from 2,000 years ago. Now, I've obviously tidied my husband's farm office up too much because I couldn't wave one at you today, but I've always kept this because in 2000, the opportunities for saving money by reducing waste came in. Now, it's quite a big document. I love this because it's designed for farmers. It's as important today. I think you can still get a copy online. I filled it in for our farm at the kitchen table, but it made us look at how we were managing all our resources on our farm. Inputs, outputs, and 23 years later, it's still as valid. In 2005, farmers were introduced to cross-compliance. And the meeting good agricultural and environmental conditions, statutory management requirements, and that included soil, water, air and environment. We then introduced to environmental stewardship, entry level, higher level, countryside stewardship, and on our particular farm, we're going full circle because we're now going, what's the next step for our wider family farm? But when you think of poultry, and when I say to students sometimes, we're a small chicken farm, we produce 1.5 million chickens a year, they think that's a lot of chickens, but in reality it's not. When you think how many chickens are being processed a week, probably between 18 to 20 million chickens. So we're small. But we've been on the journey of decarbonising for over 20 years because in 1999, the Pollution Prevention and Control Act was brought into law. There was a requirement by January 2007 for all poultry sites, that over 40,000 bird places and many pig farms as well, to have an environmental permit to operate. Now I decided in 2002 I was going to fund my own PhD and do it part-time for 5 years because I wanted to look at what metrics should we be using. If we're comparing different farms, kilowatts per kilogram, is that the right metric? And you have to remember we were heavily embedded in fossil fuels at the time. So, from that time, all intensive poultry farmers have had to have energy audits, have had to be looking at what raw materials they're using and to look at how their environmental impact is reducing. Climate change levy, 2000. Because we were using fossil fuels at the time, we had to enter into the climate change levy agreement. That was a real lesson for any farm. I don't know how many farmers were involved in it, are still involved in it. That was a real lesson to us on what carbon markets might be. And the real challenge of having to bank carbon in a good year for when you had a really cold year and you had to, for environmental reasons and for animal welfare reasons, keep your chicken houses at a certain temperature. Then renewables came along and the renewable heat incentive. I would argue that if there are the right triggers for farmers and the financial support from government, farmers will decarbonise very quickly if it works within their business model. And if we're going to decarbonise and produce food, the government has a really important role in looking at how they can support our food system in transitioning. In that time, we built enough renewable wood chip boilers to have just under 1 megawatt of renewable energy to heat our chicken houses. That is a complete step change for decarbonisation. We have 75 kilowatts of solar. Why? Because the grid in Herefordshire cannot accept any energy that we produce we're not using ourselves. So we're totally held back by the grid in being able to not only decarbonise further ourselves, but support all our neighbours that live around us to decarbonise too. We're looking for how do we increase capacity in the grid so farmers can play a real role in the use of solar and decarbonising. How can we have battery technology that first of all is ethically produced so that every person, no matter how old they are in the supply chain, has been supported in their work and we're not using children in lithium mines, for example. How do we make sure that we are ethically developing batteries that farmers can use to be part of the decarbonisation story? So in terms of chickens, what is low carbon farming? And this is where we come to the real challenge in all reports where the words carbon neutral and net zero are used interchangeably. They are totally different things. And I believe that farmers are not being given enough guidance to understand the difference. I want to know what the carbon balance is on my farm. I want to know what the decisions I'm making and what is the upfront carbon cost. What's the upfront carbon cost of 1 megawatt of wood chip boilers? How do we factor that into our carbon story on our farm? What is the carbon embedded in our poultry houses, in our concrete? How do we drive the building sector to really take hold of net zero? Because it's totally outside our control as farmers. I want carbon neutral concrete. Because if we just focus on emissions and not our total carbon within our businesses, we are not truly looking at the carbon impact of food production. And equally, we may end up with more carbon up front to be net zero and not actually have any impact on emissions long term. So farmers really need this information on low carbon farming and what it looks like. The one challenge we have as a business is the carbon calculator and land use change and how that is calculated for soya. It's completely outside our control how our feed is formulated. We're in an integrated system. But if I switch to peas from Nottinghamshire, why is the land use change when the Sherwood Forest was taken down 2,000 years ago not included in that carbon calculator? Because why are we not looking at whole models and considering the carbon footprint? Because we will never be net zero on our farm all the time we account for soya in our feed. I worked out we had to plant 1,400 hectares of trees to offset the land use calculation, not the embedded carbon, but the land use calculation for soya in our feed. We can't do that as a business. How much would our poultry meat cost if we had to do that? But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be responsible. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at our businesses, how we can drive them to be more efficient, both to drive food security so that every person in this country has equal access to safe, nutritious, affordable food, but also that we can address the challenge of climate change. It's a really big issue, but it's something that we all have to think about as farmers. And I believe that farmers have more opportunity to deliver than to be a problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Blair Mai Abbey, Shemai Abbey, Croeso I Profisgol Harper Adams. Abby, well done for getting here. So Abby is a dairy farmer and deputy president of NFU Cymru. She's a third generation mixed farmer, farming in partnership with her parents and uncle just outside Cardiff. Goldslands Farm is home to 200 milking cows, 150 sheep, 90 beef cattle and 120 acres of arable. As I said, Abby is the current NFU Cymru president and a good friend of Harper Adams, deputy, there you are. It's all right, I was just seeing ahead. And Abby, we really look forward to hearing your 8 minutes, and well done. I believe you've got some slides, so yes. We look forward to that.
Diolch. Thank you, Michael. Right. There are a few guys who were stood at the back with me on the naughty step as well. If you want to come down and have a seat, there's some right down the front. So please do feel free if you want to come in. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. I'm farming down in South Wales. I've had a terrible journey up, so it's great to be here now and speak to you. This is my farm. So Wales is obviously famous for a lot of hills and mountains, but there are a few flat bits, and I'm on more of the flat bit there. If I gave you a little bit of a background about Wales just to start with, and then I'll come on to my own farm. So as part of NFU Cymru and part of the overall aspiration of NFU, we have set a target to be net zero by 2040. So what exactly does that mean for farmers? We said that we were going to achieve this in 3 different ways. So one, and the most obvious one, and I think the one that should appeal to all of us as farmers or industry workers, is going to be production efficiency. That's the easiest one. It's get better at what you do. And we all enjoy doing that, so why would you want to do anything else? And I'm not going to labour on it now because there's not enough time in 8 minutes. 2 is renewable energy, and Louise has just talked quite a bit about that. There's all sorts of challenges, but there's a huge amount of opportunities. Number 3 is the one that I find the hardest to grasp, and that is carbon sequestration. what on earth does it mean? How do we value it? Is it in our grasslands? Is it in our hedgerows? Is it in woodlands? What is it? How are we going to make it work? When you look at Wales in particular, there are some controversial issues going on in Wales at the moment. So we've got our new farm support payment that is being developed. And potentially there's going to be a condition as part of receiving that payment that all farms in Wales will have to put 10% of their land down to trees. Now that is getting really controversial for all sorts of reasons. And so as a farmer I was looking at that and thinking, well, how do we make this work? Because we could grumble about it, or we could see if there's an opportunity. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about, a little bit about the opportunities. So at the moment, if I was going to put 10% of my land down to trees, we're a 700-acre farm. I've got about 35 acres of trees, so I'd need to take another 35 acres out of production. Ain't going to happen. It's just not going to compute in my world at the moment. And lots of people talk about, oh, well, you could take a small corner out here and a few shelter belts and, straighten your fields up. It's never going to take out 35 acres. So we need to think a little bit more outside the box. The other side of the coin is when we start talking about tree production, people get, very protective of land that we work incredibly hard on to maintain, to produce food from, to provide our income. And if you suddenly start making that do something else, take it out of production, put it into trees, maybe you've got a mortgage on it, whatever, you're going to change the status of that land for a very long time, and it can get quite controversial. But all the same, I spend a lot of time on social media, and this is going to sound like a bit of a dodgy story now, but this is where I met a forester. And I will tell him every time I speak to him, I call him a hippie. He is a tree hippie, and I am a farmer. And farmers are very practical people, and then we have these tree hippies. So trying to find a consensus about what we were going to do if we were going to start an agroforestry trial, was certainly, well, I'm not taking my grazing ground away from my cows. You're going to have to come up with something better. So this is a map of my farm here behind me, obviously all the red lines, and that's got all our paddocks. We chose as one field where the yellow arrow is. It's a triangular shaped field, bedrock pretty close to the surface. And I've picked the tip of the triangle. It's a real pain in the neck for going around with the mower. The cows can't reach it for grazing. So it wasn't necessarily something that I was too concerned about taking out production. The other key thing that I had to consider as well, in the introduction it said that I farm in partnership with my parents and my uncle. So the land is owned by my father and my uncle. So we suddenly get into that dodgy area of succession, and how is that going to work? And it did involve quite a difficult conversation about when succession comes along and that land is going to be divided, where's the line? Because if I'm putting trees in the ground, they've got to be on my side of the line. But we did get there in the end. We looked at planting the trees, so we chose an awkward corner for all sorts of reasons, made sure it was in the right place, and that is what we were going to do. And Helen's already alluded to willow. What we're going to be doing is two different things. One is trees, but the forester that I met assured me that trees should only ever be grown if they're going to be useful and they're going to provide an income. And if they're going to provide an income, they have to provide it in either 2, 3, 4, or maybe 5 years. Because if you wait any longer than that, arguably for a farm, it's a very long time to be waiting for an income. And that started to appeal to me. So we were going to grow strips of trees in rows, so you can see in the different blocks how it was going to be panned out. But we were going to have short rotation coppice, lime, aspen, and willow grown in these strips alongside one another. The idea being that you could harvest them in 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, and they could go into various products. One in particular was this low carbon concrete that we'd heard of earlier, because it can be turned into biochar, then ground down, and then go into concrete or plaster displacement. So suddenly we've got a value for these trees. They're a perennial crop, so you're going to chuck them in, and they're going to survive. You'll chop them down every couple of years, and they'll regrow. So that's really good news. In between those trees, this was the bit that I found really exciting. We were going to grow another type of crop. And they call this an arable crop, but I beg to differ. It's called Sida, which is S-I-D-A, and it's an imported crop from Poland. It's a rhizome crop. It looks like a bush to me. If you were going to describe it, it's like a cross between a sycamore sapling and a maize plant. That's more or less what it's going to be. This is a very high protein tree, for want of a better word, shrub, bush. It's got massive leaves. These leaves are supposedly, and this is where it all gets a little bit mythical, but we'll go with it, supposedly huge suckers of carbon because they've got such massive leaves, such a huge surface area. Remember I said it was a bit like a sycamore tree, bigger than that. And they've got these rhizome roots, these incredible roots that will go into the ground. And some of you might be wincing at rhizome, but it's not quite as Japanese knotweed type dangerous rhizome. So we're going to have this crop. It will suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. Some of it will be turned into protein. It's also going to be a very, very high protein crop. So what that is going to do is potentially displace soya. Now, we struggle to grow soya, particularly in Wales, but we could grow this tree in Wales in a corner of a field on some quite shallow soil, I hope. So if we can displace soya, happy days, we're going to take a crop from that shrub twice a year, once in May and then once again later in the year in October. The crop that we take in May will be the high protein crop that can be converted to soya. What I love about this is the forester can tell me everything about how you plant it, but he has no idea how we're going to harvest it. And that's where the farming bit of knowledge comes in. And I can't really go into that in a minute because I'm running out of time, but it is quite exciting. And I think this is the key thing. So the other part of it then, every time we take that crop, yes, we're taking the carbon off that is above the ground, but we've also got carbon that's going lower and lower and lower into the ground. And when we talk about carbon, we actually need to be talking about what's below the soil, not what's above it. And that was what was key to this crop. And that's really what appealed to me. It was all about money. Okay? You can have all sorts of fantastic aspirations, and we do some amazing things on our farms to make people feel welcome or to understand what we do as farmers. We produce safe, traceable food. We look after the environment. But we still want to earn money. We want to earn a decent living. And that is really what did it for me. This really is just a little bit more of an example of what goes on. I think perhaps the most interesting photograph that I can point to is the one at the top there with the people in it. What this does do is break down a lot of barriers. You know, farmers are talking to foresters. Where did that happen? But a lot of these people are volunteers who just turned up. This is an opportunity to attract new staff to the farm because we're doing something exciting. There's all sorts of things that you can do to make it a lot better. That is just a photo of the site. And yes, I appreciate that it is quite a nice looking silage field, but we are in a tiny little corner at the top there. I'm not going to go into that because there's no time. This is just the final key point that I want to make, because I think this is really important. And when we're talking about trees, you have to register it. On this side here is Cheryl, one of my babies. Cheryl is descended from my grandfather's herd. I know everything about her. She's 4 years old at the minute. She's in calf with her second calf. Very, very proud of her. She produces about 8,800 litres a year. She's part of a 200-strong herd that I deal with day in, day out. I can tell you her sire, her grandsire, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Lots about her, and she's everything about the farm. On this side here, we've got what I term a twig. I know nothing about this tree. I couldn't even tell you what tree it is. You know, I know I've planted 4 varieties in the ground, but I don't know the difference between them. I don't know where it was born. I don't know how long it's going to take to grow. I don't even know what it's going to look like. And these are some of the challenges, I think, when we're talking about trees. As farmers, we're very rich about heritage and culture and history. Whether your history is 1 generation or 10 generations, it doesn't matter. We're rich with that. Trying to move into that tree world is a little bit complicated. But it's something really that we are going to have to develop. And on this last one, am I going to send it the right way? No. So really, this is just a final photo to say that I've struggled to grasp this, but I do see opportunities, and agroforestry could be one of them, I hope. And if I can overcome barriers like that, then hopefully other farms can too, and hopefully this can offer a lot of opportunity. People are watching us, people are waiting for that good story, and all of these experiments that we're seeing on farms, at universities, here at Harper, you know, they're to be celebrated, and let's hope that everybody gets some success. So thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Abby. So our final panel member is Stephen Briggs. Stephen's a first-generation Cambridgeshire farmer, looking at cereals and also doing a lot of work in agroforestry. He has concentrated on agroforestry during your Nuffield, I believe it's Stephen. Stephen has a soil science background, so we were discussing about this just before the start of the session, and I very much look forward to hearing more about that. Stephen currently is Head of Technical Innovation for Agriculture and a Non-Executive Director of AHDB. Next week, I form my first meeting at the FAO as a technical advisor, and I need to catch up with Stephen later because he's got a lot of experience associated with the FAO. So I look forward to hearing from that. But Stephen, you're 8 minutes. Thank you.
I can only apologise in that I only found out that I was talking this morning yesterday. So this is, but there is a theme emerging, and I think the first thing I would say, Abby's just left us saying that there's a lot to learn and a lot to share, and I've also interacted with quite a few foresters, and the one thing I would say is we've got more in common than differences. If nothing else, we both make a check shirt look good. So. Where are we? So what I've been asked to talk about a little bit is a little bit about our own farming business and the route to net zero, what we've done, some of the challenges, how we sort of tackle inputs. There seems to be a bit of a common theme about agroforestry, about stacking enterprises and some of the challenges ahead. And I guess one of the biggest challenges to start with is that I'm a tenant. I'm a new entrant to farming. I jokingly say I started with nothing and got most of it left. And when we're talking about long-term projects like routes to net zero, land tenure and having a landlord which is on your side is massively important. Certainly been a challenge for us. You know, we own a little bit of land, but the majority, I farm over in Cambridgeshire. We're a small unit, 110 hectares, mainly tenanted. Half of that's now in agroforestry and has been for 15 years. We've also got a farm shop and we've been moving to sort of net zero. And the drivers for me really were that when we moved onto the farm 15 odd years ago, the soils were in a pretty tired state. And as a soil scientist originally, I needed to do something about that. And we went from soils that were either blowing away or they were concrete. And we wanted to move towards sort of a more multifunctional land use, embed more biodiversity, move towards sort of net zero, and open up new market opportunities. So our soil types are really either a sort of a fen soil or heavy brick clay, a mixture of the two. And these are what I call minute soils. They went, in 1 minute they're porridge, in 1 minute they were concrete. So one of the first things we did, much like Helen, was to look at both biodiversity benchmarks, construct nutrient budgets, do lots of soil analysis, do lots of economic benchmarking, and work out where we were starting from. Really important to know where you're starting from. And we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that actually it was fertiliser use that was really our major challenge in terms of reducing net emissions, both at a farm level but also throughout the supply chain in terms of manufacture. That's where our main challenge was, and that's where the industry sees it. So moving to reducing that reliance and adopting different farming systems was something we needed to try and achieve in a reasonable period of time. But actually, these are obviously some of the inputs, but a recognition when I was doing my Nuffield a few years back, that actually the biggest input we all have as farmers is sunlight. And recognising that something like a wheat crop only uses 65–68% of the available solar radiation. If it used 100%, there wouldn't be any weeds. So we're missing some of the biggest input to our farming systems in terms of capturing that solar radiation. How can we get more of that input? Because it's free. The sun goes out, it's game over for all of us. So as a forester, there are nice little links between our talks here, unplanned. But as a farmer or a forester or a PV engineer, we're all in the same business. We're all harvesting sunlight. And there are times of the year when there is near maximum solar radiation. But as an arable farmer, I turn the solar panels off. So if I want to capture that energy, how do I keep the solar panels turned off? So these are some of the things we've done. And a recognition that actually nature's worked this out a long time ago. It does different things with different species and different plants at different times in different space to capture as much of those inputs as possible. So what we've tried to achieve on our own farm is to stack lots of enterprises in many ways. We've created what at the moment is one of the biggest agroforestry systems in the UK. We stack both productive fruit trees, pollen nectar areas, crop production, all in the same field. My landlord charges me rent on a per acre basis, linear. Thankfully, he doesn't charge me on a per cubic acre basis. There's lots of free land up there and down there if we choose to use it. So we're already now, we're sequestering about 4.5 tonnes per hectare from having trees in the system. These are fruit trees, so we're getting a fruit crop and an arable crop. We need a splash of milk from Abbey, and we've got apple pie all in one field, so what's not to like? We've got it to work. We're working, there's plenty of evidence at farm level in the UK and throughout the world, and from research showing that these sort of stacking of systems can work in terms of space and time and be profitable and productive. We're running a system that's running at about 20% more productive than a conventional system in terms of monoculture, because we're stacking those enterprises and harvesting more inputs in terms of light. It is more complex. It is much more management complex, for sure. We have to drive straight, because my combine harvester doesn't like trees. It tends to cough a little bit with those. So just a few pictures, sort of what it looks like over in our part of the world. As I say, we put our farm through farm business survey every year, so we look at the economics, and it's coming out, you know, in the sort of top quartile of farms, so it can be productive, but it is more management complex. We've done some work with the Woodland Trust and the Forestry Commission, and your figure was interesting in Wales, Abby, saying 10% as trees. The work that we've done with the Forestry Commission would suggest that if we had 5.8% of our land under tree cover in some form, that would largely meet our net zero commitments under the Paris Accord. What I've described in our own system here, we're only at 8%. So we've got 8% of the land area, 4 hectares of trees interspersed with crops on 52 hectares. That's 8%. So we're above where we need to be and pretty close to where you're being challenged for in Wales. So it can work. And remember that as farmers, we don't need to do the whole farm. We maybe can select parts of a farm to try some of these things on. One of the things this has done is it's led us into a controlled traffic farming system. Because as we've regularised the way we do things in an alley cropping so arable system, it's led us very much down to the rationalisation of our machinery and controlled traffic, which has led to lots of other benefits. We now plant everything on a wide row and inter-row hoe it. We've not used any nitrogen fertiliser in 15 years now. So it is possible, but it is a challenge. But that's led us to intercropping. So now not only do we have, not only do we have a tree at one level, we have a crop at a second level, and we have a base level with a legume growing all the time. So we've moved from having imported nitrogen fertilisers to growing nitrogen fixing fertilisers in the terms of companion plants and harvesting that sunlight to do that. And it's not perfect, and we do still have problems, and we still haven't got it cracked, but we're moving in that direction towards a sort of living mulch type system. So it's about stacking those enterprises and recognising the power of nature in harvesting sunlight. But what we have done all the way along is had a recognition that we've been taking out for many years more than we've been putting in. When Jethro Tull said ploughing is fertiliser, he was describing the oxidisation of embedded carbon in the soil and turning into fertiliser. And we've got very good at taking out and not so much at putting it in. So we've been monitoring our soil, and we've moved our soils very much from a bacterial to a fungal dominance, and we've managed to move it in that sort of right direction. Just a couple of slides to finish, Michael, but I thought this was an interesting comparison as well. In terms of thinking about the whole supply chain, a bit beyond our farm gate, where is the money made in the food chain? Well, the farming bit is the light blue at the bottom. Everything else above it is in the food chain in terms of food manufacturing, wholesale, retailing, distribution. You could actually change the title and put where is the carbon in the food chain. So not only do we need to think at a farm level, we need to think about the scope 3 emissions and where they sit in the supply chain, because they're coming at you. The supply chain will be asking us as farmers to actually account for what we do throughout the supply chain. So before we think about actually selling our own carbon, we need to have a real awareness of what's happening in the remainder of the supply chain. We've done our own little bit. We went completely mad 14 months before COVID and opened a farm shop, which is a whole other level of pain as a farmer in terms of dealing with the public. But it does give you some interesting insights into what's available. We've put solar up, but we're limited by grid connection. We've only got 15 kilowatts. We've looked at wind power, but tenancy is a real issue. So there are lots of things you can do, but tenancy and land tenure is something we've got to overcome. So just to finish, really, change is constant in our industry. We're pretty good at adapting to change. We need to be driving that change and being in control of it rather than it being done to us. And as part of that, you need to benchmark and measure where you're starting from and where you're moving to. Think about identifying what assets and strengths you've got. Understand that food chain, because you are in it, and it's going to be knocking at your door, asking you to account for what you're doing. So understand that. Stack those enterprises for resilience and harvest those opportunities and the resources available to you. Our mantra has always been yield for vanity, profit for sanity. So I'm quite happy to have a smaller yield provider. I can capture some of that value and shorten that supply chain. And importantly, only do things you enjoy. Life is short, and we need to make sure we do things that make us happy. As is always the case, innovation will be key, and we're all good at innovating. So let's continue to do that in the spirit of moving towards a net zero target.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Okay. If you'd like to take a seat, and if I can ask Helen, Abby and Louise to join us. We have Lord Deben waiting, so we're going to have a tight discussion session. So if you have a question, please use your arm in the usual fashion to indicate. But while you're thinking, I'll ask the first question to the panel. Does net zero mean lower yields? Helen, you talked about offshoring, and you talked about thinking about the size of your herd. So will net zero always mean that we're going to produce less food in the UK?
I don't think so, because I think what's been interesting today is that we're all looking at productive trees and how actually they can become a huge part of the production story. I think what Stephen's just been talking about, the fact that you can lift yield on a per acre basis by stacking enterprises and doing things differently, I think gives us lots to play with. So I think this tension between farming and the stuff we're going to have to do for carbon, particularly trees, is misguided. And it was really good to hear you talking, Abby, about how, you're kind of, like me as a farmer, you're not taught about trees, and so actually how you actually start to engage with that and learn about a different way of producing food. So I don't think it does. It can't over time. I think it could do quite the opposite. And it will make us more resilient, because I want all these trees in my landscape so that my cows are not going to suffer from the heat stress they suffered from last year. There's big penalties coming our way if, certainly in the dairy and the animal sector, if we don't have those trees for shade and shelter. So anyway, I hope it's not.
It depends if we inset or offset. I could be net zero tomorrow if I invested in carbon sequestration off my farm. Would I have a viable business? Probably not. But what we're seeing is that there are a whole raft of businesses developing strategies that is business as usual, and I'll offset off my farm. And there are other businesses that are looking at insetting, better resource use, better efficiency in their business. The best thing we can do on our farm to be net zero is have a better feed conversion rate. And so, no, I don't think it means less yields, but it means a different kind of thinking.
Abby?
So I think we've summed it up quite well there, but it's basically going to be different, isn't it? And Helen raised a really good point about trees for shade. I put a clip up on social media yesterday of wading through water in one of my fields, which only about 4 days before we're taking a crop of silage off the neighbouring fields. So, we've got a changing climate, and potentially we're going to have to change a little bit of what we do, and that may or may not mean lesser or more yields for your farming business. It's going to be entirely up to you, but we've still got a commitment to produce food.
I don't think it necessarily means lower yields, but I think it will mean probably different farming and different approaches to farming. And I think there are things the conversations we're having today, we wouldn't have been having 10 years ago. The approaches that technology can bring, whether it's mechanisation, automation, breeding, whatever, the things that we can use to our advantage will result in different farming systems than we perhaps have seen or we even see today. Perhaps the biggest blocker, it's often said the biggest level of compaction in agriculture is just above the shoulders and just between the ears. and maybe it's thinking what is possible is the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and I think you exemplify it really well with that stacking of enterprises. You might have multiple yields of different products which collectively delivers more food and more nutrients. And maybe that's what we should look at it, nutrients out of the farm, which is critical. So I've asked for an extra 5 minutes. Lord Deben says that he doesn't mind. So we have a question right up the back there. So if we could take a microphone, bounce up and down, wave, shout. There we go. And please, can you introduce yourself as well so our panellists know who's asking the question?
Thank you. Good morning. Rachel Maley-Davis, Hubbarchy Cymru, Meat Promotion Wales. It's probably, Stephen, you alluded to Scope 3 emissions before, and this is going to be a massive driver for us going forward. But how does a panel think that we don't lose sight of the fact that the climate crisis is intrinsically linked with the nature crisis? Naturally, as farmers, it's important that we have both on our radars. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Short answers, please, because I want to get another question in.
They go absolutely hand in hand. But for most businesses, they're still at the starting blocks of understanding where they are on that journey. So it's imperative that we take the responsibility to measure where we are and benchmark it so where we're going, both with nature and with carbon.
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. Perhaps we've not put as much emphasis on it as the farming industry as we should have done, even though it's going on in the background. Bugs in the soil, vitally important. In fact, more important than a lot of what we hear about these trophy species that potentially people want to release. We need to start thinking about these small microorganisms and the insects.
So I think it's also thinking at catchment level. So yesterday I was in the Lythe Valley in Cumbria with a group of farmers in that catchment that are looking at how they can manage water so that they can farm. They're looking at how they can produce food, but also how they can produce the optimum biosecurity and environment within that catchment. So we've talked a lot about farms today, but there's also a lot of work going on at catchment level, which is really quite exciting, and farmer-led.
Yeah, and I think most of the solutions I've been talking about actually will help us with both. That's what we've got to look for is the win-wins, and be just careful where we're trading off carbon against nature and other things like water.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think that's critically important. If we think about sustainability as a single metric carbon, we're in trouble. We've got to think about the interconnectivity. And biodiversity net gain, of course, is really, really topical at the moment. So I'm going to take 2 questions, Alice, above panic. Just 2 questions. Carl, and then we're up here, and then we'll have to go to Lord Deben.
Thanks, Michael. Carl Williams from FAI Farms. Can I just ask the panel, do you think the calculations are wrong? A lot of what we do in farming and agriculture is just recycling carbon. So on Helen's farm, what your system's doing is pulling CO2 out. The plants are pulling that out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The cows eat it, belch out a certain amount of methane, produce milk and meat, and we're being penalised purely on the emissions of that system. And I don't disagree that we need to be more efficient. I just think the calculations are pushing us in a direction which is not necessarily right.
Oh, I'd love to be a panellist and answer that one. Helen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key issue you're alluding to is probably the methane challenge, and whether you look at it as GWP star. This is complicated territory, but methane is going to be in the spotlight, whether we like it or not, because it's the one trigger we can pull quite quickly, which will have an immediate impact if we can reduce methane on the warming potential. And the fact that you are recycling the carbon doesn't really let you off the hook over the medium term. So I think we do need to be thinking about methane, we can try and justify all this in any which way we can, but there's clearly quite a lot of stuff we can get on with and do better that will be better for the natural environment. So I think some of this is a no regrets, no brainer for us. And getting too caught up in how do we measure all this stuff and what's the absolute right way to do it might just distract us from getting on and doing stuff. That's the worry.
So I think the challenge is Scope 3 emissions. We as farmers are being asked to address Scope 3 emissions for many organisations over which we have no control in their operations. And they require us to have certain standards on farm which have an embedded carbon system. And as farmers, it's one thing to be carbon neutral on your farm and your farming system, but we are also now being expected within the calculators to include the carbon upstream over, again, we have no control. So I think the carbon calculators are challenging for farmers who want to be carbon neutral on their farms.
So speaking as a farmer and not as a Deputy President of NFU Cymru, the calculations are wrong, they're very unfair. But they are being made by somebody who's over there in the outer stratosphere, and there's not a huge amount we can do about it today or tomorrow. And we still need these good news stories, and you're right, we've got our own carbon issues on our farm, but we've got so much more that we can offer. We're one of the very few industries, if not the only one, that can sequester carbon or make it better or reduce methane, whatever we want to do. We've got those opportunities and we've just got to grab them.
The question's an interesting one because it raised the concept of cycling rather than sequestration. And most of the policy and academic work seems to be around sequestration. As a farmer, I'm not really interested in sequestration. I'm interested in cycling, and it's like the bath. You can put more in through photosynthesis and growing stuff, and you can take some out. But as long as you put more in than you take out, we're on the right trajectory. And we've been on the wrong trajectory because we've been taking out more than we've been putting in.
Yeah, really, really good point. I think I'd love to add to that, but I can't. So I'll speak to you later, Carl. We'll go up here. Last question.
So, Seamus Gallagher from Benjamin, UK. We already have been working on the circular solution from farms. I'm Irish, by the way. And we have a farm in Cornwall. Within 12 months, we've reduced the carbon footprint by over 90%. But Stephen, you mentioned something very important there. You said that farmers will be forced to decarbon. Hi, sorry. Yeah, you mentioned that the farmers will be forced to decarbonise the entire supply chain. Milk, as you know, was dropping in price back to 40p per litre, and so farmers are going to be stretched just to produce food and to keep the farm afloat. So why should the farmer have to foot the bill for this, as a good environment rather benefits everybody? And so my question is more or less to the room rather than the panel, that if we're going to be forced to decarbonise, the consumer should ultimately pay. And so the dairies should pay the farmers an extra 5p a litre for milk. Louise, you should get paid a premium for your chicken, because you're going to all this trouble to benefit an environment that everybody benefits from. Therefore, everybody should have to put their hands in their pocket rather than just the farmers. And Louise, another question. You didn't mention what you did with your chicken litter.
Okay, I'm going to direct that away from the audience back to the panellists, because we haven't got time for you all to answer that. So, brief statements, please, on comments on that.
I don't think I said that farmers will be forced, but I think there will be a lot of pressure come to bear on us as farmers from our supply chain partners. The imperative here is that you understand. You understand where those carbon emissions sit, because unless you can understand where they sit, you've got no bargaining power. It's just being foisted upon you. So my statement is really engage in that process and understand where those carbon emissions met throughout the supply chain.
Yeah, Stephen, and your comment about the value chain is absolutely right. We've got to understand where that value chain is and also challenge the value chain. Yeah. Abby.
Well, society is going to have to pay for it as well. I think that we've got two responsibilities here. One is getting our own business carbon neutral, which is a responsibility for every individual. And then there's, can we do more? And if we can do more, can we sell it? And then you could flip it on its head and say, well, could we sell those bits first and use that income to make ourselves carbon neutral? So that's a possibility.
I think we will be driven by changes in farm assurance standards to decarbonise, because the market wants us to decarbonise. It is the right thing to do to decarbonise, especially if it drives your bottom line, so it drives profitability. In terms of our litter, under our legal obligations, we have a letter from any farmer that buys our litter saying they will comply with good agricultural practice. As poultry farmers, we have no control over how they use our poultry litter, but what we can do as farmers, which we are doing individually as a farm, is looking at alternatives rather than land spreading. However, if we're seeking to reduce the amount of artificial fertiliser, and we're then saying that poultry litter is not going to be used as one option, then we have a real challenge in decarbonising crop production.
I think it's a really interesting question, who pays for all of this, and I don't think that it will be consumer markets that do in the long term, and that's why I think some of these other opportunities coming through are more likely, as well as kind of thinking about the externality markets, the carbon markets and all that kind of stuff, which are fraught at the moment. I think that our lenders will be looking at the resilience of their farms and perhaps giving better rates to those farmers who are doing the right things. Same with insurance. I think there'll be a number of drivers, but there is a big investment that's required, and I think Abby hit it on the head when she, could you get some of that up front to do the work we need to do to decarbonise, or do we have to get there and then hope we get some benefit afterwards? I think we just need to find a way of getting this to work so that farmers can do this stuff. They've got the labour, they've got the capital that they need to actually be able to put the things in place, because it's a big task and it's got to be done fast.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we can all thank our panel members, Helen, Louise, Abby and Stephen.